Welcome to the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Since 2010, the Doherty Water for Food Global Institute at the University of Nebraska has worked toward one goal, a food and water secure world. One in which global food security is ensured without compromising the use of water to meet other essential human and environmental needs. It's a daunting vision, but one that is vitally important. This podcast amplifies the voices of those making waves in this space. We hope you enjoy today's episode.
Now, I want to just start and talk about the early days. In the field of community organizing and activism and environmental activism, there were a lot of women, even in the very early days in the beginning of the movement. And it's actually not, while it was less usual, I'm talking back in the 70s and 80s, to have women in leadership in government. Government is one of the arenas where women were able to make their mark. Flash forward 30, 40 years to being the chair of the board of the State Water Board in California during the worst drought in modern history, in addition to other things. But the thing that was noteworthy here is that this was the first time a major board of 5 in the state had 4 women on it. And it was noteworthy. It was noted everywhere. We were known as the dream team. I'm not sure it's totally because of our gender, but we really were the best board I had ever seen in terms of being respectful, listening to stakeholders, and being open to creative examples. Is that because we were women? I don't know. I think so.
That voice belongs to Felicia Marcus, a woman leader in Water for Food who's been making a difference in water policy for over 30 years. And she's our guest on this edition of the Water for Food podcast. I'm your host, Cindy Zimmerman. Felicia Marcus is an attorney and consultant who's served in positions in government, the nonprofit world, and the private sector, most recently as chair of the California Water Resources Control Board. She's also active on a number of volunteer boards, including the Doherty Water for Food Board. In addition, Felicia is a member of the Water Policy Group, which is composed of experts with direct experience working with water policy issues within governments and international bodies. In that role, she recently participated in a Water for Food webinar on innovative approaches in agricultural water management and regulation, which is a subject which she has extensive knowledge of from her work in California. Felicia discussed efforts in California dealing with overuse and contamination of groundwater within the agricultural production areas.
The point I want to raise for you is the issue of the policy choices one has in trying to deal with very real issues on the ground, and the policy choices that California made to try and design our programs in a way that would work best with agriculture, focus on results rather than minute-by-minute command and control directives. And it's very much of a work in progress and an experiment on both counts that we are optimistic will achieve better and more durable results faster than the traditional regulatory model that's been used in the other industrial arenas, because agriculture is different. Agriculture is obviously essential for human sustenance and the health of communities, economic, social, as well as physical. But nonetheless, the use of too much water, fertilizers, and chemicals has negative consequences, externalities, as we say, for communities and people through overdraft or contamination. We're faced with two choices. One is to go the traditional regulatory route, which we refer to as command and control, where we would create an entire architecture of how folks needed to reduce their over-reliance on groundwater basins or to lessen the amount of chemicals, particularly nitrogen, that were being applied to crops. We had calls from the environmental and some other community sectors to essentially set limits on how much nitrogen you could use on a given crop. There's not really a lot of science behind that in some crops. And in California in particular, where we grow a lot of fruits and vegetables, the crop are varied by field. They vary from season to season. Sometimes you can have different crops in the same field in the same season. And so trying to do that would have been impossibly complex and would have been been met with even more resistance, I would say, than what we did do. So we thought we'd try and be a little more creative. Our selection was to go with what someone yesterday called on a different webinar, collective implementation, which is to try to figure out how to use the spirit of community that is frequently present in agricultural communities, the knowledge on the ground, as well as understanding the responsibility of a community to deal with issues within their own community as a cultural norm and something people like, in addition to the fact of not liking being told what to do by a governmental bureaucrat in a cubicle in Sacramento or Washington or wherever your capital may be. And I'm going to give you a couple of quick examples with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the Irrigated Lands Regulatory Program. And why do we do it this way? Frankly, because we thought we'd get further faster in terms of achieving the results by trying this approach. And we wanted to harness that collective wisdom and responsibility. And again, I'm not saying this is all one big happy family and that it's not without controversy. There are many growers who think we still went too far and that there isn't a problem or that they could deal with it on their own. And there's also environmentalists who don't think we went far enough, which is always the case in policy. Just a quick look at California generally. You see the Central Valley in particular. It's not the only agricultural region, but it gives you a sense of the scale of it. In California, it grows 90% of healthy fruit, some food crops and vegetables like salad, greens in many months of the year for the entire country, 90% of certain specific crops like avocados and nuts. It is one of only 5 Mediterranean climates that can grow the scale of healthy fruits and vegetables that it can grow. So it's very precious. But at the same time, our groundwater basins have been overdrafted producing an abundance of food and fiber, and that despite all kinds of incredible work on ag efficiency, which has led to even greater yields, but also even greater lands being planted. And the estimates are that we've been overdrafting those groundwater basins by over 2 million acre feet a year on average in the San Joaquin Valley. Has a tremendous impact in terms of infrastructure crumbling, where you have canals that can no longer convey as much water. You have a loss of flood control. You have roads that can crumble. And in particular, the compaction of our clay layers and our aquifers they're not like a sponge. So once they collapse, they can't be used for storage anymore. And if you look at the spine of the mountains in the Sierras, they contain an awful lot of snowpack, which is on average a third of the storage in the state of California. And with climate change, we're going to be losing it. And our groundwater basins are the only thing that can approximate that loss in size. So we have to figure out how to manage it more aggressively. California had not had any regulation at the state level of groundwater management. And so we came up with a plan that basically requires localities to create their own groundwater agencies, and there are certain rules for that by 2018. The high-risk basins, particularly in the southern San Joaquin, had to submit plans by 2020. Medium risk had to submit them by 2022. And the requirements are fairly straightforward. They need to come up with a plan to show sustainability within 20 years, and that's defined as essentially not going back to the 19th century or even the 20th century, but to figure out a way to not go beyond the safe yield to remain at the levels they were at in 2015, which many people thought not aggressive enough, but it's still going to be a difficult thing to do. And sustainability is defined as avoiding undesirable results. And there are a set of those in the law. It includes making water quality degrade, a host of other things. And it's done by a combination of active recharge and more creative recharge and demand management. And of course, demand management is the most controversial of those. And then the state just plays kind of a umpire or backstop role that the Department of Water Resources finds that a plan's inadequate or a deadline's not met. Then the State Water Board steps in as a backstop to impose transparent pumping and reporting fees and fees where people have to report their pumping publicly, which people don't want to do. It holds some hearings, and in the worst cases, actually propose a plan, which can be interim or long term. And we hope to not have to do that at all. They're now evaluating. We have phenomenal compliance so far, which is great, either because people are afraid of the state water board, or as I think people knew in those communities that they needed to deal with this issue if they wanted their grandchildren to be able to farm. There is a lot of community spirit in our agricultural communities. And I think this just gave a framework for the people at the local level to be able to make the very hard decisions that they need to make locally. But we had over 95% compliance with setting up of these groundwater sustainability agencies, which is not an easy thing to do. It's like creating an entire new governance system. We have the same level of compliance with submitting the plans, which is really phenomenal. And they're now being reviewed. Really a pretty good start. And you're seeing this amazing creativity in trying to figure out how to deal with recharge. When it comes to demand management, there are all sorts of, there's not one size fits all. You have all sorts of plans. The whole issue is to form a collective for collective implementation, do an adequate plan with realistic recharge potential and adequate demand management, implement the plan, and then we'll stay out of your face. And then the government role is technical assistance and funding review, and in the last instance, stepping in to assure that somebody takes care of the problem. Similarly, in our irrigated lands program, which is even more complex, our problem was the widespread contamination of groundwater from decades of irrigated ag and dairy operation. I'm not going to talk about dairies. They're handled under a different dairy order. But we had a huge problem with the contamination of drinking water wells, particularly small communities and domestic shallow wells, and as well as contamination of surface water. It's a challenging issue. It's one with significant health effects. And there were calls and an outcry as we realized how many Californians, hundreds of thousands to 1 million, were relying on contaminated groundwater. And there, of course, in the same instance, there were calls for traditional regulation along the lines of industrial pollution historically, or we could have done something different, and we opted to do something different. This is not unique to California. This is true anywhere you've had farming. It's not evil polluters. It is people who have been doing a socially productive thing, growing the food and fiber we rely on, but using nitrogen, sometimes more than is necessary, either in water or in direct application. It's just an externality and a byproduct of it, but it actually has an impact that we need to deal with. So our objective was to reduce those nitrogen loadings. And in our initial draft approach, and this is done by various regions in our system, and then it comes up on appeal to the state board, and we can make a precedential policy decision. So I may be talking about that. There were calls for us to regulate, as I said, every crop and how folks ought to farm it. We were leery of the ability to do that, and we also knew the resistance we would get, and we would end up just fighting over it for years rather than actually getting anything done. Our initial draft tried an approach that's innovative, but wasn't that popular with farmers, of just using data transparency to drive reductions, that have farmers actually have to look at and report the amount of nitrogen in the water they apply, they add to the crop, less what they pull out in the crop. So you would start to get a basis of knowledge of who was using how much. And farmers could see with each other that they were using more than another guy who was just as, or woman who was just as productive, and that just knowledge of it would help drive less use. That was met by an outcry from agriculture for a lot of reasons, that people don't want government in their business. They don't want the world to see what they're doing, even their neighbors, from time to time. And to make a long story short, our final decision allowed for, again, this collective implementation where we allowed for the use of coalitions to achieve measurable results over time. Farmers still have to provide that data, but they provide it anonymously, presented anonymously. It's anonymized, but it's by field and by crop on those fields. And it paints a picture of who's doing what. Outliers are identified. Farmers then talk to other farmers and say, hey, Bill, you're using twice as much nitrogen as Jane for the same crop yield. Did you realize that? And as a whole, they need to show measurable results over time. Very important, we paired it with the testing of drinking water wells, notification to folks if they were drinking water that was close to or over the limit. So we kind of use the community spirit, but also the desire to keep one's information private to come up with something that said that if folks could actually show that by township that they were reducing it, then that's fine. That's what our objective was. And there's obviously backstops there too. Hopefully we'll start seeing some very important reductions in the very near future. The key point is we focused on the problem. And so then in exchange for not doing a traditional regulatory program, we just said, well, focus on the drinking water issue, because nitrogen in groundwater is not a contaminant for farming. It is a contaminant for drinking water, which is only a small percentage of what's used. So let's focus on solving the problem. And so in conclusion, in both of these, a focus on results with flexibility on how you get there, enabling local responsibility, but also accountability, recognizing values in the community. We did it because we actually think we're going to get better, faster results. And we're using our regulation as a driver and incentive and a backstop, not what we might call here paint by the numbers, and reward good results and incentivize them and reserve the traditional command and control tools for people who are truly laggards. And finally, is it going to work? Well, only time will tell. I sure hope so.
Following that webinar, I had the opportunity to interview Felicia Marcus to learn more about her and her life's work. So first of all, Felicia, tell us a little bit more about your background.
Well, I've been doing water work and environmental work for 30 plus years. Have a history as an environmental lawyer, public interest lawyer, but also as a private sector lawyer, and ran the City of LA's Public Works Department and was a US EPA regional administrator in the Clinton administration for the Pacific Southwest and the islands and 143 Indian tribes, and then was the chair of the State Water Board in California most recently for almost 7 years during the worst drought in modern history, which is definitely a job that had an impact on me. And I've also worked in some of the national environmental organizations as a senior leader.
And recently you also joined the board of the Dougherty Water for Food Institute. Why did you choose to accept that position? And what do you think about the work that DWFI does?
Well, I was honored to join the board. I mean, I think the Dougherty Institute is fascinating and working in an incredibly important space, and unique in the sense that it works internationally, but also works domestically on real world solutions to real world problems. And I like that it had the issue of agriculture and food, thoughtful and efficient water use, and thoughtful and efficient interaction and management of natural resources, all in the same bucket, because people want and need all three of those, and they tend to be separated into different silos. I always call these ecosystems rather than ecosystems of practice and focus. And the only way we're actually going to be able to manage productively for all of the things people need, figuring out how to efficiently grow food and fiber while not despoiling the environment that supports it and us in other ways, is really the challenge of our time. And so you've got the Institute is doing exactly that in a way that isn't just theoretical fancy, but is actually practical on the ground work with people around this country, but also around the world in a way that's very empowering and uplifting. So it was just a whole package of things that were very appealing.
Well, we just listened to a recent Water for Food webinar where you participated on about agricultural water management and regulation. So speaking from the viewpoint of California, tell us a little bit more about how the state has been working with farmers to balance the water demand for agriculture with environmental concerns.
Well, it's a challenging thing. There's not a simple answer to that. And there's an overlay of California's very antiquated water rights system. I mean, it's fine. It's like most of the West in terms of being a seniority-based system. It's just the least fleshed out of any of the Western states. So it's just messy and a little bit muddy, no pun intended. And so what California's been doing on the water supply side or water regulation side is really trying to upgrade our capacity to be able to actually manage the system in a transparent way that's understandable. I mean, there's just a lot more heat than light some days. And so a lot of what we focused on during the drought, when we had to make some very painful decisions on how to alter our existing water quality management plans, which control flow during certain times of year, certain critical dry years, normal years, wet years. We realized that we just didn't have the information we needed. So we doubled down on information because that was basic, understandable. People could understand it, to get enough information to even lay a foundation to have a reasonable conversation about how to modernize the system so that it was implementable, because it was very difficult to implement, and people had very strong beliefs on what their water rights were, which have never been trued up. And that's a much bigger, complex thing. We just thought if we got more information, we could have more intelligent conversations with people. At the same time, we did a lot of regulation in agriculture because there was a need to. Our groundwater basins have been overdrafted to the tune of 2 million acre feet a year, for example, in the Central Valley, which has produced this miracle of food and fiber, enhanced productivity, in addition to a tremendous penetration of efficient use of drip systems and telemetry and all kinds of things. But it's been used to produce even more, and been used to expand farmland into areas that were traditionally unirrigated pasture, for example, or not grown, and the advent of far more permanent crops of vines and trees with their concomitant water demand and inability to be fallow, that has created a combination of things where we got into something of a pumping war. So he with the deepest pump wins. You had domestic wells running dry. You have farmers seeing their wells run dry, and a real tension. And so we passed a Groundwater Management Act, the legislature did, and the governor signed and supported and pushed, so that we could sort of staunch the bleeding, but also figure out how to preserve those groundwater basins for storage up in the coming years, where climate change is going to rob our snowpack with just a few degrees temperature rise, and we need a place to put it, or else we're going to have even greater shortages. So it was a combination of things, and we came up with a proposal not to do top-down regulation, but to just create an architecture of regulation that put it on the local communities to organize themselves, come up with a plan that would work for them, and if they did that, we're fine. If they don't, then we step in and do it, regulate for them, with an eye towards never having to actually do that, but just being sort of the 800-pound gorilla that gives people the political will and the backstop to be able to do hard decisions locally. Because we thought, we're going to, geologically, every community is different, particularly California, much more so than in other states. We've high seismic activity. We have the mountains. We are the most, variable hydrology, but the most variable geology underneath the land. So the groundwater can be different in one place, and a mile away, it's going to be completely different. So doing it locally actually just made more sense as well. And we'll see. It's a grand experiment in local governance to avoid the state or federal government coming in and trying to do the precise regulation that people in industry, they don't love it, but they accept it. I think in agriculture, it's even more irritating. And so fine not to do it, better to let local people deal with the community resource, because essentially what they're trying to do is make sure their grandchildren can farm.
Well, as you pointed out, water can be a very emotional issue on both sides, and particularly with farmers. So talk about how using this approach, this community approach, helped you to kind of bring this two sides together without emotion getting so much in the way.
Well, it's an interesting question, because from a governmental standpoint, what we did slightly different in each is really thinking about what is the appropriate role of government. There's that backstop role I talked about, where it's a federal system. The federal government does with the states on a lot of issues, where nobody wants the federal government to tell them what to do. So it gives them the impetus to make hard decisions at home. But it also sets out here are the rules of the road and the basic standards, and then there's an umpire element that is calling balls and strikes on whether these plans are adequate. But there's also a role that is technical assistance that's provided in our case by the Department of Water Resources, which is seen as a less scary institution than the Water Board, which is the regulator and enforcer. It's not one big happy family, but it's kind of a grand experiment with some folks in the disadvantaged community activist world and the environmental world actually trying to work with farmers to help make it easier to succeed. And in the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, there's also this added piece where, unlike traditional groundwater law, if you go to court for an adjudication, for example, that's all about how to allocate fairly water as among overlying landowners. It also includes a requirement to deal with connected surface waters that have an impact on ecosystems, which is perhaps a more advanced part of the law because it takes into account the reality that these things are connected. I mean, many of our groundwater basins were disconnected from surface waters many decades ago. It was all originally connected, but we still have quite a few important waters where there is a connection, and we do require in these sustainable groundwater management plans that they do take that into account. And that's a bit of why you have more of the environmental community stepping in to try and help folks in agriculture deal with it. Again, it's sort of, this is an amazing governance experiment on whether we can make what Tess Dunham, who is a brilliant lawyer who represents many in the agricultural community, refers to as collective implementation, which I really like as a phrase, because it also recognizes that the community values and community spirit of a community is a real thing that has real value. And I think frequently in public policy, we can be somewhat dispassionate, and it's why I don't mean disparagingly when I talk about people not wanting to be regulated by someone in a cubicle in Sacramento or DC. It's not to disparage the person in the cubicle. It's just that the person in the cubicle isn't a farmer. I wouldn't dare to tell a farmer how to farm, but I would encourage them to deal with the externality of their farming, either through contaminating someone's groundwater or through over pumping their aquifer so much that their grandkids aren't going to get a chance to farm. So I think in regulation, the trick is figuring out how not to just be a one-size-fits-all top-down set of tools, but how to use that authority strategically to achieve something on the ground with people. And I just, in my 30 years of doing this, both the federal, local, and the state level, I've seen it work. It just takes pulling people together and really listening to them and helping them figure out how they can achieve an objective together versus just fighting for their own peace or making someone else a demon.
You've said that this approach is an experiment, that the jury is still out on how this is going to work out. When will you know? When do you have certain benchmarks that you're going to meet that you will know better how this approach is going to work in California?
Two different sets and two different timelines. In the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, folks have to have a certain deadlines to do certain things. And so there was a 2-year deadline to form these groundwater sustainability agencies, and they had to be over a subbasin. You could have multiple agencies with an MOU on how they were going to use similar tools and metrics, but you had to cover a subbasin. We had over 90% compliance with that, which was really awesome. And then the most high-risk basins had to put in a plan within 5 years. And we had over 95% compliance with turning in a plan. Now they're in the process of evaluating the plan. And the plan has to show how that groundwater sustainability agency is going to achieve sustainability within 20 years, which is a long timeline, but it's going to take a lot of action to be able to deal with the magnitude of this problem in a way that doesn't destroy and disrupt agriculture, I think. So the idea is to do a combination of both groundwater recharge through using recycled water and capture of water during the wet times that heretofore had just gone by, and then demand reduction, which is going to be some kind of allocation amongst the overlying landowners or a trading system or a fee system. There are a whole suite of tools that have been in use in the well-managed urban aquifers for a long time. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but people are being very creative. So it's not an easy thing to do, but they've got to have a plan that shows how they're going to do real things that are going to get to that area. So right now, those are being evaluated, and there are a number of issues where it depends on, is the glass half empty or half full? There are all kinds of problems with the plans, but it's a first draft of the plans. And so that one, I think they're going to need to remedy some of these issues where they haven't taken account of making more domestic wells run dry, or where they haven't taken account of the surface water. But I'm an optimist, and I feel like if the Department of Water Resources says, okay, you haven't done this, that people will, in the next draft, get it right. So again, we'll know based on how good the plan is. In the contamination side, it's going to be faster. Folks have got to show that they're reducing their nitrogen loading by township level as opposed to each farmer. But that way, what you can do is you have farmers have to share into the collective, not give directly to us, although we can go in if we absolutely have to. And it's anonymized. When we get the data, we just don't know whose it is, how much nitrogen there is in their water, how much nitrogen is applied, and how much is removed in the crop. And then the coalitions will plot it, but they'll plot bell curves, and they'll be able to say to one farmer, farmer talking to farmer, hey, Joe, you're using twice as much nitrogen as Jane is for the same crop yield. Did you know that? And I think we believe we're going to end up with a huge reduction just in people actually having to take account of how much nitrogen is in the water plus how much they're applying, but also, again, using the collective spirit without, giving up the special recipe for how you do your farming, but at some sort of an angle that people are outside the norm and that they will course correct because they'll save the water and nitrogen too, and we'll start seeing it. And that needs to be reported. So we'll know. But there will also be, the regional boards will get this data every year, and there have to be every 3 years, there has to be a big review at the state board, which will be the review of, is this working? So hopefully, particularly in the first years, we'll see a pretty big drop just as using the information applied in this collective anonymized way, I think will be enough, I hope.
With the type of data that these initiatives are gathering and considering California's diverse geology and soils and types of crops, do you think that other states and countries might be able to learn from what you're doing?
I think there's a potential. I mean, first things first, it's dealing with your own issues in a way that deals with the locality. Again, I'm a big, maybe because I was in local government and had the experience of having state and federal regulators think they knew what they were talking about when they didn't, because they didn't know the context in which we were working and the details. And I felt that way from the environmental community as well. I feel pretty strongly about the need to be respectful of local conditions. And I think for us, we have a particularly varied, as you point out, geology. We also have, the most varied set of crops because we're specialty crops. And so that also would make it impossible, I think, in any, in a decade or two to be able to come up with particular levels of how much water, how much nitrogen you need for a given crop, much less be able to implement something like that. I mean, it'd be impossible, and people's cropping changes all the time. So, when you're dealing with greens and fruits and nuts and all of that. So nuts, maybe because they're a permanent crop, you have a little more shot at, but I still don't think it's the best way to go. But I think it'll yield a lot of data that hopefully the anonymized data that's just by farm and crop, that there will be researchers and academics who can comb through whatever becomes publicly available data to draw some really interesting conclusions. I think the hope is in the irrigated lands program, there's also need to do management plans. And, it's based on requiring that a farmer really think about their inputs and show they have, right, through putting out data and having a plan. The more you start integrating these things and then trying to incentivize the healthy, good things that have multiple benefits, I think the more healthy we'll be as a society too, rather than trying to do one little piece at a time and regulating it.
Well, as a wrap up, we hear a lot about feeding a growing population, how we're going to do that in the future. With that in mind, what do you see as the opportunities and the challenges facing the water management and regulation community going forward?
Well, I think we have tremendous opportunities to use water more efficiently and effectively for multiple benefits. So I think there's a lot of upside. I think a lot of the upside is on the development of new technologies that make remote sensing and sensors on the ground and telemetry, big data way more accessible to farmers, to regulators, to the public. I really think transparency versus mystery is our friend here. And I think that the ability to put more tools in the hands of farmers to get more to the kind of precision ag we're going to need in order to do more for more people with less inputs is all to the good. I also think the next generation demographically for all of us is more comfortable with the use of technology, and I think that's a good thing. It's true in the urban setting too, in terms of support for water recycling and other things. We're going to have precision ag, precision urban, and precision environmental management, frankly, and data and sensors and tools will help us get there. That's all on the good side. I think where we still have problems is I think our societal engagement, the thing I call kind of the ecosystem of things, which is not just the ecosystem of a given group, but the ecosystem of our interactions with each other. It's not about big egos. It's about the people in the system, I think, is a little behind. And I think there's first instinct is to try and avoid loss and protect themselves. And a way to do that is to, the folks that are in whatever your pod is, the water cooler, agree with each other. The other people don't agree. Therefore, they are either stupid or evil, or they want to take water away from you, or they want to take something away from you. It's sort of like the talking points as if regulators or environmentalists wake up every morning because they want to hurt agriculture, or farmers get up every morning so that they can dump as much water and nitrogen on a crop so that they can poison water. I mean, that is not what's happening. It's people are doing the thing and caring about the thing they care about, and there's not enough interaction between the two. And that, I think, our societal ability to figure out how to overcome those natural protective and societal silos is behind the technological advancements, and we have to find a way to do it. That said, there are wonderful miracles and stories. Someday I'll write about these. I probably should write about the good news stories of people coming together across really amazing divides that are a counter emotionally to the stories of people fighting, the fish versus farmer, north versus south, ag versus urban, that we absolutely have to get away from if we're going to make responsible policy choices and actions on the ground. In my experience is that whether it's a farmer or an environmentalist, an urban person, a rural person, people actually just prefer to get along. I think this is my one political comment. I think politicians and lawyers and lobbyists thrive on the discord. So there are a lot of forces of distraction and dissension and disenfranchisement. There's a lot. Forces towards disempowerment and discord are really great, but regular people don't want that. And so I think when you actually go into a community and work with people and talk to people and try and create connection, you can. It doesn't always work, but you can frequently find major epiphanies and folks who figure out a way to work together. And I think we just need more of that in more places.
Well, amen to that for sure. We all need to work harder at working together. Well, thank you very much, Felicia Marcus, for being our guest today on the Water for Food podcast. A lot of great food for thought there. We appreciate you sharing with us. Thanks for joining us this time on the Doherty Water for Food podcast. Make sure to visit our website, waterforfood.nebraska.edu, to view show notes or subscribe so you don't miss future episodes.